My name is Jennifer Gray Thompson, and I'm the Executive Director of Rebuild North Bay Foundation. This podcast is specifically designed to bring you people who have been through what maybe you have just gone through or that you are concerned about. We created the podcast How to Disaster to show you the breadth and depth of humanity in the midst of this really terrible thing that happened. I wanted to do this podcast so that I could bring some of the most amazing leaders that I've ever known in my life to you. You may have just experienced a disaster, and you may be looking around and you are dealing with trauma and the shock of it. And you may be wondering, I don't know how to do this part. And so we purposefully made this podcast into different sections and different topics of recovery so that you could pick and choose what would work for you at that time. So welcome to How to Disaster, and thank you for giving us your time. Welcome to the podcast, How to Disaster. In this podcast, we try to help communities learn how to recover, rebuild, and reimagine. My favorite part of this podcast is amplifying the really cool, smart, talented, innovative people that I have met in this space. Sometimes they're local, sometimes they're public officials, sometimes they're in the private sector, sometimes they're emergent leaders. Today, I'm really happy to have with us Dr. Christa Lopez, and I met her about 2.5 years ago at a conference in Washington, D.C. hosted by Fannie Mae and the Institute for Sustainable Development. We got along right away, and she is one of the truly impressive, just as a bonus, female leaders in this space. We have stayed connected and been at a few conferences now together, including one in her own home state of Texas. Currently, Dr. Lopez works for the Texas General Land, the GLO. What is the O? You're going to tell us what the O stands for. Office, so obvious, right? The Texas General Land Office, which for some reason has a plethora of really cool, powerful, smart women in this area, in the field of disaster. So I asked Christa to come on today to talk about her own background, because I'm really fascinated by the fact that she really started in this work by assisting her husband in their crime scene cleanup business. So that's very interesting. But I also wanted her to talk about her PhD, her thesis in how to be culturally competent and effective in a disaster, where that's helpful. So her research in that area is of great interest to me, and I think it will be to you as well. And I just wanted to get to know Dr. Lopez on a wider level and hear about all of her experience and her take on disaster and what's needed and where we're headed, especially in this age of really people are finally accepting climate change in the face of huge climate disasters. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Lopez.
Thank you, Jennifer. I am so glad to be here and to join you all. And I did have a very different path to all of this, but I think everyone who works in disasters and emergency management doesn't usually come into it off the ground or out of a college degree and is like, this is what I want to do, right? So I'll back up. I started my life career in horticulture. I was a plant science major in college. I studied biotechnology and really was involved in campus life and realized, wow, I could work on a college campus. And that really fascinated me. And so I shifted careers and went straight from undergrad to graduate school. And I ended up getting a master's degree in counseling. And I spent close to, I would say at least 19 years in higher education. But each year in higher education, I kept getting assigned to these crisis roles. I kept getting drawn into the campus emergencies. I helped to develop policies around emergency management, actually, and evacuation policies for the residence halls on campus at one university I worked at. And in the background, I was volunteering. I was volunteering as a firefighter, as an EMT, and then search and rescue for 15 years. Wow. I had a human remains detection dog. My very first search that I ever went on was the Space Shuttle Columbia crash in East Texas. My first volunteer / assignment after I got my EMT license with the fire department was to go to New Orleans the day after the levees broke during Katrina. So I've had some unique opportunities and really great lessons. A little bit of drinking by the fire hose, as we call it, because they were on the ground in real time, life lessons about real-time disasters. And I kept touching those things in my volunteer world and really felt the calling to make it a profession. So I sought a second master's degree in emergency management and a number of other trainings, and then moved in 2015 to Texas Division of Emergency Management, and was quickly promoted into a role overseeing the Individual Assistance Program. That's the program, when folks think about FEMA funded programs, that's the one that helps individual households, right? So, you know, that is perfect for my background in counseling because I understood what the human need was. I understood the complexity and diversity of individuals and people, and also could apply that to the disaster world. So from that experience, 2017 occurred here in Texas, and so did Hurricane Harvey. My knowledge in the Individual Assistance Program, which includes housing, and then also having worked in higher ed housing for almost 13 years, it was a perfect pairing, and FEMA approached the state of Texas, asking the state to run the first ever FEMA funded state-led direct housing mission. That's, you think of FEMA trailers and temporary housing and so forth. That's what we were asked to run. And so because the General Land Office was going to take on this mission, they were also informed they could borrow or take any staff from other state agencies to help implement this program. So I shifted from Texas Division of Emergency Management to the General Land Office, and here I am. So that program went on for 3 years. I now oversee all of the grant operation programs for the General Land Office, and also serve as the chief of staff for our team. We have a staff, full-time employees, about 200, plus about another 300 vendors. So we have a large team, and our overall mission right now is implementing as well as administering all the community development block grant funds for disaster recovery that HUD funds to the state of Texas. So we work a lot with individual households as well as our individual communities. So
for people
that's
who
it.
For people, you can just be like, oh, that's all. But for people who don't actually understand the complexities of individual assistance or block grants, navigating each of those is difficult. Navigating both together is monumental, and the amount of attention to detail, understanding of the landscape, understanding of the field of disaster from, you know, really the people who are boots on the ground are most severely affected. The individual to the institution is no small feat. So you can go on about that for a moment. It's a lot. Yeah,
it is a lot. And you know, as a disaster survivor, and as you mentioned, I completed my PhD work, and I looked at disaster survivors' experiences with disaster volunteers, and from a lens of cultural competency, you know, because volunteers come into communities, there are different cultures than their own. They're different people, there's different ways that folks go about doing life. And so that being said, these are also folks who have experienced the complexities of disaster in itself, right? So there's so many layers to unpack when it comes to a disaster. There's that immediate experience, identifying those quick basic needs of food, shelter, you know, do I have connection to my family? Am I healthy? Those sort of things. And then it's, okay, so where are we going to live while we rebuild? Often, you know, if the home was destroyed or majorly damaged, navigating those federal programs is absolutely a monumental task. You said it on par, because even those of us who have been in this field for a while, the rules change on us, right? It's not even the same from disaster to disaster. And so we get why folks are confused by it, because we too have to remind ourselves, oh, I'm working with somebody from this disaster, so it's these rules, right? There is some,
and the number one rule is always to meet people where they're at. Use the tools that you have to adapt into that space. But it's,
Right.
I think unless you have a learning mind, this is impossible work, unless you're like
Of
open to
course.
never, ever, ever, ever knowing at all.
Oh, absolutely. And, I like to say that insurance is absolutely the first step in the process. Um, I also get that sometimes you're having to make a decision between insurance and paying your electric bill or buying groceries. So I know that that's a challenge for a lot of folks out there. But insurance truly is the first step. That is the step that will probably make any household as close to being complete and whole as anything else. The FEMA programs, they say up front, although it's not remembered often, but they say up front their intention is not to make people whole. It's to help kind of fill a small gap. And
But
then
also,
those,
sorry, but people
sure.
don't, until you've undergone a disaster, there's this, we are natural, we are human. And so there's a certain amount of magical thinking that's involved, which is, and I'm not talking about what happens with poverty or having to make that decision between your insurance, get renter's insurance though, like that's $5 to $10
Yes.
a month. So please do that. But it's that idea that you don't, obviously these are skills you don't need until you need them. And
Right.
that can make it very difficult to prepare for and then respond to. So I think there's there's almost like a shock wave, a second shock wave after a disaster, and people realize that FEMA's job is not to save you. That's not what they do. Like they might save you physically. They might like have some services. They do the very best that they can. They are way overstressed at this point. Last year we had $20 billion over disasters, and they counted all of our wildfires, which is the worst season on record, 10 million acres, $16.5 billion as one of those. So FEMA is not going to, they're going to help you. They're not going to save you. And so I think people have to know that in advance.
Most definitely. Most definitely. And it is complex, right? Because they tell you register at disasterassistance.gov. Then you have to figure out, is your county one of those counties that's eligible for the disaster, right? Not just did your state get a disaster declaration, but is your county? I know there are cities here in Texas that span 3 counties. I've seen where 2 of the counties have been declared and the third hasn't. So if you live in the same city, you all may not be served, right? So that's how crazy this can get. Then once you register, they might refer you to SBA, which is the Small Business Administration. Oh my gosh, a disaster loan. I'm already overwhelmed by this disaster itself. How could I imagine taking on a loan, right? But it's understanding the benefits of that loan, right?
So if you can get it though, like I love SBA, but in our case, about 80% of people were denied. And so so I think SBA pulled off a miracle last year. So for all of our friends at SBA, I'm not knocking you so much as, talking about how we can change the message so it's more realistic at the outset. That's all.
Absolutely. It is a loan and you have to qualify for it, right? You have to show that you have an income and that you're able to repay that loan at the terms that is agreed upon. Yeah. And so especially last year, when so many individuals were unemployed, there was no way to prove that you'd be able to repay that loan, right? So that compounded those issues. Then a year or 2 later, these people like my staff from the General Land Office come along and go, hey, we've got money from HUD. How about if we rebuild you a house? And then it's like, wait, but that disaster happened a couple of years ago. Why are you coming now, right? Because it literally takes an act of Congress to get a federal appropriation, which just means get money, to bring money in for disaster recovery. And it sometimes takes 2 years to implement, if not longer.
We just got money from 2017 that we had asked for and was appropriated in 2018, like last week. And it had to be, and it's long. And here's the thing, recovery is long, and FEMA and our federal agencies, they're trying to prevent fraud. So we totally understand that. We think there's some ideas though that we can move it a little faster, that they could do it in tranches and at the same time do fraud protection. And you're also often dealing with, sometimes you're dealing with counties or states that are not super well resourced, don't have the staff, don't have the knowledge, they don't know how to navigate it. It's one of the reasons why we do advocacy in DC, but And we do it with the public sector so that we can support their efforts. But everyone's a novice in disaster until you're not. And then, and so it's just important to know that the money is slow, the recovery is long, and it is possible.
Absolutely, 100%. It is definitely, as they say, a marathon and not a sprint.
Yeah,
for sure.
So in Texas, you actually you have a lot of rural counties. And one of our big concerns has been as these climate disasters are increasing for a variety of reasons. In wildfire, it's actually just where the climate change is meeting a historical land mismanagement. And that's just, it's all the things coming together at once. So rural counties are a very big concern of ours. Like, we are concerned that counties, if they're not well resourced and they don't have the staff or experience, it's very difficult to navigate. The FEMA process, or even the state does a lot of the FEMA process, but it's just, so what do you run into in rural counties? It's different from, say, like when Houston took place, or Hurricane Harvey. Houston was actually super savvy in so many ways. And not that it was perfect, but there were a lot of corporations there. There was about $220 million of donations came in. But how Houston's going to recover is not going to necessarily look the same in another much more rural county that didn't get that sort of attention and doesn't have those resources. Can you talk about how you navigate that from a state perspective?
Sure. So, we have to give equal attention to all of our jurisdictions. But we do know our rural jurisdictions do really have a huge challenge. They may have one building inspector. That one building inspector might be also on their public works team. Maybe they're also their emergency manager or their floodplain manager. So they're wearing multiple hats. They're not getting paid the same as a building inspector in another city. So, and I bring that position up because when you think about a disaster, the first thing that has to be done is buildings have to be assessed for their stability. And so who's that go to but your building inspectors, to your public works staff. So jurisdictions have to think about, in rural areas and cities, are they involving those individuals in that disaster preparedness? Are they involving them in training? Are they involving them in their plans so that they can pay them emergency pay, so that they can work all those extra hours that are going to be placed on them, right? Then rural jurisdictions are now faced with what we call the social media or news effect, right? The news media comes in and they highlight those cities, right? They highlight the big jurisdictions, and that's where the donor dollars and the volunteers flood into. But sometimes those rural jurisdictions, not that they need it more, but it's just different.
Sometimes they do, though.
And they might need it more because maybe there are more resources within a larger jurisdiction, right? So they're now at a further disadvantage because they're not getting the same attention through news media and social media that some of the larger jurisdictions are. They may not have the resources or knowledge how to manage volunteers or donations. So when donations flood in, there's cash donations, there's in-kind services, and then there are goods that are donated. Those unsolicited goods can sometimes be a disaster into themselves. You hear, I've heard over the years, and I've witnessed, because I've done donations management for disasters, I've witnessed dirty mattresses being donated. I've witnessed cat costumes. And one year we had someone donate pickled sharks. Like, I don't know why.
In VAKs, I interviewed Kelly Thompson and Mark Martin Bross from VAKs Love, and somebody sent ice skates. VAKs is off the coast of Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico, yeah. They don't need anything in VAKs related to ice skates, yeah.
Yeah, so, we tell people don't, unless it's asked for, please don't send it, no matter what. Like, your need to give has to be less than the need to receive, and it's very nice. Yeah. And there are things you can do to help, and one of them is don't create a secondary disaster. Like in Paradise, I went and I was in the Walmart parking lot that you all saw on the news, and I saw the biggest bin I've ever seen in my life, like a 40-foot shipping container, 20 feet high, overflowing with with in-kind physical donations all headed for the landfill. So that's another consideration, has to go beyond that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then there's cash donations, and a jurisdiction, a city or a county, they can't collect that. There's tax implications to that. So then they have to find someone who has an established 501c3 or nonprofit to manage that. And if they didn't think about that ahead of time, that takes time to implement. And you have to find someone you're willing to trust will do right with those funds, right? And account for them and be able to show, what they're going towards. So then you have the resource donations. You have well-intentioned folks showing up on heavy equipment machinery who may or may not be licensed to demolish houses, but they might say they know how, right? And do they create a secondary disaster? In my dissertation, I recounted the story of individuals following Hurricane Harvey. There were some folks operating heavy equipment machinery, driving up and down the street. A couple had some downed trees in their backyard, and they said, "Oh, we can haul that out front for you." So they quick jump on their machinery and they start pulling the trees out front to the curb, and they ran over the septic field in the backyard, not paying attention to what was in the backyard, and then caused $9,000 of damage to the septic tank. It's unintended consequences that come from really great intentions. So having a system in place for those rural jurisdictions to know how to manage all those things, because their first thought is to manage the disaster itself, but there's all these little things that come after it. It takes time and resources, being people as well as vehicles, to drive FEMA around and show them all the damage in order to get the money to rebuild. So,
and what's interesting, it's so different though. What's interesting is that in a wildfire, there's really nothing to see. We're like, nothing to see here. It's all a bomb went off. You don't even recognize it. There's nothing to gut. There's nothing to muck. There's no mold remediation. And that's another thing that both wind and rain and wildfire have so many things that we can hold in common and share. But also like this learning curve we're all on in the era of mega fires, which just didn't happen before with this frequency. So it's always so interesting for me to hear from a wind and rain based person. Not that you've never had a wildfire in Texas, but So
2011 was a rough wildfire year for us, for sure. And
so talk about volunteers. So I love that. I love that. In your dissertation, Dr. Lopez, one of the things I was really interested in was the idea of cultural competency. So it's not just a matter of, it's, let's assume everyone is well-intentioned. We can talk about fraud in a different part of this conversation, but cultural competency, and like you in California, we have a significant population of the Latinx community. And making sure that the first rule, which I know we've already talked about of disaster, is serve the community that's in front of you, right? So talk about, I think that's such a powerful subject for your dissertation. Can you talk about your findings there and your advice?
Yeah, so I interviewed disaster survivors in Rockport, Texas. That was the area that first experienced the landfall of Hurricane Harvey. And I wanted to understand what their experiences were with volunteers, and then dive deeper into, did the volunteers respect the culture of the community? Did the community even identify what their culture was before or after the disaster? And then if they had that magic ball to train and advise future disaster volunteers, what would those considerations be? So it's interesting, and I'll go to the culture of the community first. I heard very clearly in that community, there's a case of have and have nots. So it's a coastal community, it's a small coastal town. And along the coastline, like many coastlines, there's some very expensive homes and some pretty wealthy individuals. And as you move away from the coastline, you have the working class of the community. You have individuals who have lived in that community for years. You have folks that have worked on shrimping boats for generations, fishing boats for generations. And so they tended to be the have-nots. They had their own sense of community. They had their own sense of purpose, but it was almost as if there were different pockets within just a very small town of different cultures based on class, some based on race, but mostly I saw a very large class division. I had one couple I interviewed who recounted a story that they were in line to register with FEMA and to talk to SBA about assistance. And they talked about how they were a working class family. And in line was a gentleman who was from a very wealthy portion of town. And they said, I know had it not been for Harvey, this gentleman would have never talked to us. But we bridged a friendship with him because we had a common shared experience. And we still have that same shared experience, right? And so they still have a relationship with him now. And had it not been for that disaster, they may have never had that opportunity to meet. But then I heard from another individual who shared, things were great at the beginning of the disaster. Everyone was generous, people were kind. And as I spoke to him, he said, I was in church one day and the preacher said, well, things are getting back to normal. Everybody's crabby and cutting everybody off and they're not being kind anymore. And it made me laugh because, it's like when groups form, you go through those phases of storming and norming and so forth. And, you go back to normal at some point, right? Or what somewhat normal is what that can be. I met with 3 individuals who opened my eyes to a pocket in that community I hadn't even considered, right? We talk about religious diversity. We talk about race diversity. We talk about social class. Those are the main ones that usually come up. I met with widows. These were, and I did exact that. These were individuals who, leading up to the storm, somewhere within the previous 5 years, 2 had been widowed and 1 was of the same age group, but had been divorced. And so I kind of widow/divorcee, but these are individuals who they made life decisions with their partner. And so imagine going through one of the most challenging life experiences without that person you used to depend on to make those decisions with. So now they're looking at their home that they've lived in for, however many years. And a group of people are standing on their lawn going, oh, we need to cut down that tree for you. We need to move this. We need to do this. How about if we do this for you? How about we do that? And whoa, I need some time to think about this. But didn't even know if they had the voice to say so, right? Didn't even feel like they had the control to say so. And so they really opened my eyes to those other parts of the community that we don't always consider when we think about the diversity of a community. So my overall takeaway was each individual community really has to learn what are the pocket groups within your community. Because what I learned from one woman was almost that entire street were widows and they all had the same experience. Most of them had lost their husbands over the past 3 or 4 years. They all kind of supported each other, but they felt overwhelmed by the volunteers because they felt like someone was trying to tell them what to do, as if they had to have caretakers, right? That they couldn't make decisions on their own, that someone had to educate them about what they needed. I even had a couple who share the story about how some disaster volunteers were just very almost forceful, I guess, in how they stated, well, we have to do this for your property. You need to have this done, versus stepping back and asking people, what would you like us to help you with? And several times I would end each conversation with, if you had to tell disaster volunteers, 1 or 2 things, or if you had to train them, what would you like for them to know? And a resounding response was, just listen. I just want somebody to sit down and hear my story. And again, sometimes we think physically doing something for someone is what's best for them, but sometimes they just want someone to hear their story, and that's all. And that is as important as cutting down a tree or sifting through ashes to find the remaining belongings. They need somebody to talk to because this is emotionally exhausting.
It's a mental health issue too,
yes.
And they don't want to feel like we just took the lessons we learned during our disasters and applied them to the organization, which was we asked, what do you need? How can we help? And we don't do things to you, we do things for you, which means that we have to ask.
Yeah.
You know, if you can't listen, then, you know, I was recently in another wildfire zone, and I was talking to, we love an emergent leader who has that learning mind and a natural talent for it. But, you know, this person specifically told me that their desire was to help design a recovery that did not include wildfire survivors, that he didn't want to talk to them. And I was like, well, then I can't work with you at all. Like, can't do it. If you, this is exactly the wrong approach. Like, I'm not, that we do know, like that is a definitive thing. So I so appreciate that. And also just like, how would you ever know that there were this lane of widows who needed that listening, and then, and, you know, being told that they were empowered to make decisions. Yes. You know, community-led design and design recovery is actually key to a successful recovery. So I just I got goosebumps over that. Thank you.
Yeah. It's still to this day. I mean, there were certainly other takeaways, and overall, they loved the volunteers. They were fantastic. They wish they could have stayed forever. They developed lifelong friends. One couple I spoke to had Mennonite Disaster Services rebuild their home for them. And they've gone to the Mennonite community now up in Michigan and Ohio and visited them in their hometowns. They were like, now we have friends across the country. Now we have people we call our family now. So by no means do I want to dismiss what volunteers do. I spent my years doing volunteer work in disasters as well. So I know there's an absolute value for it, but I think if we can take anything away from it, it truly is sit back and listen, have a way to organize yourselves, train people, make sure there aren't those unintended consequences like running over a septic tank and causing more damage, or having a tree fall on a house that was almost salvageable and now really is not. Those type of things, but really sit back and listen. People want to be heard.
They do. And I think that, you know, it's always, you know, beware, look for the helpers, beware of the heroes.
Yes.
Because,
yes.
You know, people, there's a certain adrenaline rush that comes from, you know, showing up and being of service, and then, and, you know, it can be even, for some people, a bit of an addiction at a certain point. And, you know, you're like, your intentions are not wrong at all. However, you know, don't be a hero, be a helper. When somebody says to us like, oh, so will you do that for us? And I am always like, no, because I can help you. I can help you do it. That's my superpower. Is let me teach you how what was done before, you adapt it, make it better. You know, we'll support you, but this is, you can do this, and we are not saviors and we are not heroes. And I think that's really critically important.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So for how, what's your advice on how to assess where to send your cash donations?
So that's a difficult one, right? Who do you trust? So I think understanding organizations that have been in the disaster world for a while, that have a track record in history. If they're an operating 501c3, if they're an operating non-governmental organization, they should have records that are transparent about how they spend their funds. There are organizations out there that have done it for a long time and maybe aren't as transparent. So you have to think about who you want to share your money with. What type of mission do they provide? Because there's a lot of voluntary organizations out there that have a specific role in mission. Some might be those, what we talked about earlier, the people doing the chainsaw work or the muck and gut work, or taking away debris, right? But there might be some that do case management. They're out there providing individual one-to-one casework with the disaster survivors. Or maybe you're passionate about the folks that help the animals out. You know, there's animal rescue groups out there doing some amazing work. There are animal groups out there that are taking service animals to help support the disaster volunteers or first responders in their own emotional recovery, right? So, I mean, there's layer after layer, and it's almost like find what you're passionate about. And I bet you there's a group that could use your monetary donations. I'm the type of person that when I give someone funds, I give them unrestricted too. So I'm not giving it to you with a caveat that has to be used in this realm, or a caveat that has to only go to Hurricane Harvey. If you're a group that operates in disasters, I want you to be able to use it on any disaster, because Harvey might be big right now, but maybe you have a lot of money in the Harvey bucket. And if it's just called Harvey, those organizations are only allowed to spend it on a Harvey. But if I tell you it's undetermined funds, then you can spend on anything that you want, any disaster. And so I also have an understanding that non-governmental organizations doesn't mean that they can't pay their staff.
Oh, thank
And
you.
they do so much hard work. These
Mhm.
are exhausted people. They deserve a good salary. They don't deserve to get paid $27,000 a year to work 80 hours a week, helping other people recover from disasters when they themselves might also be a victim, right? Or a survivor of disaster.
Like, talent costs money. Like, that's
Yes.
the thing, is that and no one's going to become, if you're in the nonprofit sector, like, you're not going to ever become a millionaire doing this. Like, that's not going to happen. But, the idea that in the nonprofit world that you should pay people so low that they can become your own client, especially with social equity organizations. Like, I don't subscribe to that. And even at our organization, we make sure that we pay for our talent, but we expect them to use every bit of it like as if we were in the public or private sector.
Most definitely. And I think when you pay individuals a honest salary, a solid, fair salary, they will feel appreciated and they will give you good work, because you're showing them that you trust them and that you value them, and they give you valuable work in response. And so I absolutely agree with that. I think you have to pay for good services. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't want to give them a really stressful job and then make them super stressed at home about whether or not they can feed their children. Like, that's infuriating.
Absolutely. But yeah, when it comes to donations overall, I think back to your original question, find a group that aligns with your values, what you love, what you're passionate about, and consider truly giving them unrestricted funds so that they are not hamstringed by how they have to spend those funds. Please take that into consideration for sure.
I appreciate that so much. I just do. So can you talk to us about how you see the field of disaster sort of changing as more funds are put into the climate crisis? We're starting to see a lot of people who are popping up, and we love an emergent leader, and we believe that we certainly support and foster their development and want to be there for them, especially when they rise from a local community. We don't really love an emergent leader then tries to inflict themselves on a community they don't understand. I'm both happy for all of the attention coming in the funds and sort of this shift in the philanthropic focus in this area. And I'm also a little nervous because, the first rule has to be do no harm. There's a lot of fraud in disaster, and there's plenty of stuff for disaster victims to worry about. The first three types of people to show up are those who will defraud you, those who want to help you, and those who want to sell you something. So it's, critically important. But can you talk about that? How you see the future of sort of climate crisis or climate related disasters, or what you're seeing happening right now?
Sure. I'm seeing things at the federal level, because a lot of the funding I work with comes from the federal level. I'm seeing a lot of focus on resilience and mitigation. So resilience is that word that people keep throwing out there, and I've actually been annoyed by it for a while because I don't feel like anyone's defining it right. But I appreciate the word too. So resilience is really, how do you firm up, how do you steady in the wake of an event? Now, is that cyber attack? Is that a financial crisis? Is it a pandemic? Is it a natural disaster? How are you able to bounce back, and in what time? And that's really what all resilience is. It's about being able to have the tools to not have the impact be so devastating that you cannot rebound or you can't rebound quickly. So I do love resilience. Again, the term's being used a lot, but I do love it.
Steal this though,
yeah.
Christa. I always say, how do you do equity? How do you do sustainability? And how do you do resiliency? Like, don't just give me those words, like show me how you do. So I may also become better in my own job in life. Like we need to share the how of it and exactly what does that mean?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, when we think about, I'm going to nail it down to natural disasters because that's my specialty. But, when we think about resilience towards natural disasters, are we giving people the tools to know ahead of time, if there's a disaster, these are the type of documents I might need to register with FEMA so that I can get back on my feet? And are we giving them tools how to find the right insurance company and to get those policies in place? One of the things we give out in our office that we've had made are just plastic dry bags, and they have a checklist of important documents you might need in the wake of a disaster. Now, that's not going to help you on wildfire. I'm sorry.
It does, though. We're big on go bags. We have extra clothes because naked evacuations happen all the time, and they're only funny like if it's not you, but it's awful for those poor human beings. We don't have a lot of. We're lucky if you have 2 hours notice. Sometimes you have 5 minutes. Sometimes you have 10. When you run for your life, it's a fire monster is real. But so that would work too. The plastic bag part wouldn't matter as much, but the list matters. See, that's one of the things that we can share.
Right. So, having a list, knowing what to prepare. Texas experienced a winter storm of unbelievable strength in February. And everyone that I know was without power and water for some period of time. I was without it for a week. And my husband walked around the house going, I am so lucky to be married to a woman who has a PhD in emergency management. And all those crazy little things I used to do aren't so crazy anymore. Like they make lids for Home Depot or Lowe's or whatever type of buckets that becomes a toilet. You might not think you need one, but let me tell you, it comes in handy.
Okay.
You put a trash bag. You put a trash bag in a bucket and you stick that lid on, because let me tell you, sitting on the bucket by itself hurts.
And also you ask your husband if he will take care of the disposal of it.
Oh, of course. Yeah. I even bought some of that absorbent stuff that they sell if you're like doing an oil change or something, you spill paint. I sprinkle some of that or cat litter in the bottom of the bag so it absorbs some, so you're not reusing a bunch of bags, right?
Okay, so, everyone at home, though, is now saying to themselves, I now know how to make an emergency toilet, so this podcast alone was worth it.
Yes. I keep 5 cases of water in my garage stocked at all times, because you will have water shut off at your house in a fire. You will have water shut off at your house if there is a accidental leak into the water supply system, if there is a shortage of water, if there's a winter storm, you name it, water will be not potable. And so you need to have a clean drinking supply of water. If you have pets, your emergency kit has to include your pets. And I know there are folks who are like, I can't pack up my entire horse barn, all of our critters in 5 minutes when that wildfire or that monster is coming towards me. I get that, but thinking about ways to minimize the impact, because it's devastating to watch someone who returns to their home and finds their pets have perished. It really is. It is heart-wrenching.
Yeah, it happened to my cousin Gary and his wife Jean in the Woolsey fire, because they'd been on that land for 30 years and had never, they'd been through plenty of fires, but had never had these kind of mega fire incidents. And so he was there alone. He didn't worry about it too much. And then all of a sudden it roared past. Like it's a football field every 3 seconds. And they lost their, dogs, and they had mastiffs like I do. And it still is probably the most hurtful thing outside of their house, and even more so even in many ways. And so you can, though, like just briefly look up and say, who can help me in the event of a disaster?
Absolutely.
Who could show up with a horse, whatever it would take,
Right. Most definitely. I had a woman come speak to our team when I was working for Texas Division of Emergency Management, and she works for another state agency. She experienced the Bastrop wildfires that we had in 2011. And she was in her swimming pool, hanging out in the backyard. Somebody comes knocking at the gate, and she has a game cam on her front gate. So you can see the footage from the game cam of this individual, getting their attention, honking the horn and everything. And so she and a friend that was with her piled everything into one car. They got all the dogs, they got the neighbors' dogs, and they got out. And she said, you can watch on the tape, and she played it for us. Yeah. You can watch on the tape as the straps burnt and the tape and the game camera shifted from her front gate to her house. And she has the footage of the darkness, and then all of a sudden her house just erupting into a fireball, and it was gone. And she said that fast, had that person not come to the gate, that fast, those things happened. She said, but there were two of us. Why didn't we take two cars? We could have fit more dogs or stuff, or we could have, she's like, hindsight is, 50-50, but that whole perspective of think about what more she could have grabbed maybe if she had taken two vehicles. And so she kind of went through this whole thing. And my thought was, wow, what a lesson to learn about how quick from this footage that happens, right? Now I have to say the curious mind in me also wanted to know who made the game camera, because
oh my God, me too. That's so funny. I was going to ask you.
How does it survive that event that has melted everything else around? The camera, of course, was not in great shape, but the disc itself that recorded the video was. But that was a valuable piece as well, because she literally pulled that video out and showed her insurance company, and they were like, okay, done. Like, yes. There's no argument there. And I'm not saying that folks have to go out and get a game camera, for your property, but
we tell them though, videotape your home every year.
Yes.
Like it takes 10 minutes. We just had our first red flag warning, which we've already had like a month ago, whatever. Yep. Fire season lasts forever now. I was like, okay, so I'll take that 10 minutes.
So real quick on that, tornadoes are the same thing. Your house is gone when a tornado hits, right? And so I met with a couple who their house was completely gone, and their insurance company was like, well, how do we know this is what you had in your house? And I met with them, and I said, after the event, somebody in the family was standing around the grandkids, and they were like, and we were just here last week, and we were just having a big old family celebration, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, wait, did anybody post pictures on Facebook? And they were like, yes. And I was like, pull those pictures up. You have photos of the house. You have photos of the contents. So it's not always lost. Think about what you did leading up to that. Social media can be really powerful in that sense, because how many of us take selfies or, do videos or whatever have you, and you might have that video. But you're absolutely right, Jennifer. Every time I go on vacation, I use that as my mark, or even if I travel for work, I use that my reminder before I leave the house. I take a videotape of my house. If my house is robbed while I'm gone, I have proof, but then I'm always updating what's in my house and what my house looks like for insurance purposes. Most people have a smartphone, so you can do it.
So, okay. So we talked about a number of things. I would like to ask you, because we love the reimagine space. We love the idea that, we work in, we want to prevent, recover, rebuild, but also reimagine, which means innovation. What's your single greatest hope of an area of innovation in disaster that you think would have a direct positive impact on communities that are disaster affected or disaster vulnerable?
So I've spent a lot of time in the world of disaster housing, and my wish is that we can identify ways to provide temporary housing that can then be turned into permanent housing. And we in our office are doing some studies and some research on that right now. And so we have some ideas of what that might be. And I truly do feel like it's achievable, but we need the federal government and our partners who fund some of these efforts to also get on board, right? Because sometimes there's a challenge between one funding source and the other, and duplication of benefits. And we certainly don't want to go against any federal rules or to over provide to one household that is at risk of under providing to someone else. But if we can, let's say, take a temporary housing unit and then in the long-term recovery efforts, add on to it and make it a more sustainable home, and not just provide these structures that are flimsy, that can float away or fly away or burn to the ground quickly, but ones that are resilient, right? So every time we have to rebuild after a disaster, we should be thinking about resilience. We should be thinking about what materials, what's the architecture of the home looking like. There are limiting factors though, right? HOA have lots of rules around how things can and shouldn't be rebuilt and what the look of the neighborhood is. And so we probably need to start to get them involved and on board with things might not always look the same, right? Because we're doing better with it. But if I had one wish and I could wave my wand, there would be better ways to make that transition from temporary housing into a permanent resilient structure actually work. And I think the other piece of it, honestly, for me, for communities would be a better way to describe how to create mitigation strategies that work. When I hear folks talk about mitigation, when it comes to flooding, I hear about drainage. There's more to mitigation than drainage. You know, there's environmental ways that we can use natural resources to create natural barriers. I was in Indonesia several years back speaking about emergency management, and we were replanting the mangroves around the islands to create that natural barrier, right? So there are ways that we can reduce impacts of storm or surge or so forth, or in wildfire circumstances, that urban wildfire interface, that we can use other resources. So on the housing side, it's how do we make that transition happen? On the infrastructure side, it's how do we make that feel achievable and not this lofty idea, like we talked about resilience. It's not just this lofty concept, but it's something we can truly do and make happen and see a difference.
Bravo to that, because I actually loved that about the conference that I attended a couple of 18 months ago, that you all put on, and it was like innovation and resiliency in disaster, and you had even FEMA people there, talking about how do we innovate in a way for our housing, for exactly like you highlighted and amplified and showed us, showed them off to everybody. It was the first conference though that I'd been to where that was featured as a desire of FEMA. And I think that there should be opportunities for innovation, in partnerships with NGOs, public, private, nonprofit sector. I'm always amazed by how much of the technology and the ideas exist, but bringing those all together in one place and actually doing it in a pilot. We love the term pilot. Like, you want to pilot something? Let's talk about that, so that we can make mistakes and share our mistakes and make things scalable, and really that piece of housing post-disaster and doing it so much better. Because of cost, most of the houses rebuilt in where I live in Sonoma County, we're about 75% rebuilt, which is kind of a miracle, quite frankly, only 3.5 years post-disaster, but it's a very well-resourced county with high land values. So that absolutely plays into it. But that piece of how do you build back in a way where your house will survive another wildfire? My mom just happened to build this house deep into the wooey about a decade ago. And she was like, oh, I think I'm just going to build it like, with all the best practices for no reason, had never been through it. She just was like, that's what she was going to do. During the glass fire of 2020, that fire actually came into the tub scar, but it burned down all of her neighbors' homes. everything around her and her house, you could walk in and flip the lights on. It was fine.
Yep.
So there are ways that you can do it. How do you make that even financially accessible, which means innovation, scalability?
Right. There's a documentary out. I'm pretty sure you probably heard The Last House Standing. That came out recently.
Was that about Panama Beach?
It was Panama Beach. Yep. Panama
Mexico
Beach.
City? That guy
Mexico
built
City.
his house like for no reason.
Yep. Correct.
Yeah, Tim Carpenter took me to that house.
Yes.
Because we were at that conference. Yeah. And I was like, well, I don't want to speak on anything I haven't seen. So you have to drive me around for 6 hours the day before. So he did at a high rate of speed, though. I kept telling him, I'm like, so I want to talk to that person. He goes, oh, I'll stop here. But I think he's a doctor of some kind. And he built a house like to a different standard.
Absolutely.
To do it.
Learning from others, and maybe you can't do all those pieces, but where are some of the pieces you can do, right? And that's about resilience, right? Where those added layers you can put in there that make it just a little bit less time to bounce back later.
Yeah, bits and pieces, whatever's going to work. So, well, I could talk to you all day, but I do want to know one thing. Does your husband still have a crime scene cleanup business?
Yes. So we started that in 2007. He and I started it together. As I mentioned, I did search and rescue. I had a human remains detection dog for a little bit. And really, it was kind of a merge of both of our minds and our passions. And mostly it's about helping families in some of their darkest times. It's horrible to say, but it's actually rewarding to be able to be of service to others in their most challenged times. And being there for them when they feel like there's no one else who can do that type of work. No one should be re-traumatized in the sense that they now have to clean up after a loved one. That is just a horrible experience. Their last thought of that person should be a cherished thought, not whatever scene came after their passing. And so we've been doing that here in the Central Texas community since 2007, and really love the work that we get to do to help others. We also work with individuals who are in a hoarding situation or have some challenges around cleaning their house, and maybe it's gotten to an extent where a typical cleaning service would not provide those services. And again, that's a really difficult position because someone feels very vulnerable when they're reaching out to us, oftentimes embarrassed about the circumstances that have led to their home being in that situation. But we're not here to judge. We're just here to help, right? We're just here to provide a service to help them live in a safe and healthy and happy home. And so to see the look on their face when they're able to return to their home in a hoarding situation or an extreme cleaning situation, just to be able to think, I can breathe, I can be in here without hazards. That's really rewarding. So yeah, we love it. We're glad that we get to do that.
Well, it strikes me, I mean, I'm going to sort of end where we began, which is, it's not that I like what happened here or how I entered into this field, but I swear I meet these people who hold humanity at the core of every single thing that they do. And, they professionalize their services to humanity, but, that's the deal, is if humanity sits at the core of what you do, then it is rewarding. And I feel so grateful to know you and to know that there are, people like you in this field who are excelling and pushing it forward and always holding humanity at the core and never forgetting that that's ultimately what it's about.
Thank you so much. Just to end, my purpose in life, and I've told people for decades, my purpose in life is to be of service to others. And that whether I get to do that in our business or whether I get to do that in the disaster world or working with other colleagues who we can share ideas and bounce ideas off of each other and learn from each other. I think that's why I probably have so many degrees too, is I feel like I'm forever learning and I thrive to learn because I can only help people when I have, the best knowledge possible, right? Where I can serve others, and it really just helps me fulfill my life's mission. So thank you.
Oh gosh, thank you. This is a good place to end. And thank you again, Dr. Lopez, for being on the podcast, How to Disaster.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Fannie Mae, the largest provider of mortgage finance in the U.S., owns 1 out of every 4 loans in the country. You can find out if Fannie Mae owns your mortgage at knowyouroptions.com by using our loan lookup tool. This last year has been quite difficult, and making your mortgage payments could be too. There are options for those available that may have experienced a natural disaster, such as wildfire or the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the options available is a forbearance plan, where homeowners are given a period of reduced or suspended payments to manage a temporary hardship of financial standing. For this caused by natural disaster or COVID-19 pandemic, you could be eligible for a 6-month extension with a possibility of another 6 months after that. During the forbearance plan, the homeowner is not charged late fees. If you received additional living expense assistance after your disaster, and those funds have run out, you still may be eligible to apply for a forbearance plan. When your forbearance plan ends, your lending or servicer will contact you to see if you need assistance or are ready to resume making your normal scheduled mortgage payments. If you don't hear from them, you should proactively reach out. If you are unable to repay the balance in its entirety, you may arrange a repayment plan, or if eligible, qualify for other programs such as a payment deferral or flex modification. A payment deferral allows you to bring your mortgage current. This option keeps your monthly mortgage payment the same as it was before your hardship, and the total deferred amount will be due on the last scheduled payment of the loan. Should you sell or refinance, the deferred balance is included in the remaining amount due. Flex modification is Fannie Mae's standard modification. It provides 20% principal and interest payment reduction on your mortgage. Once the modification is complete, the loan's term is extended to 40 years. Depending on the circumstances, the modification may result in a reduction of interest rate and/or principal forbearance. What is a principal forbearance, by the way? And that's when a portion of the unpaid principal balance, basically the remaining loan amount, is put into an interest-free balance secured by the loan as part of the flex modification. It can be modified by the maturity date or with an early payoff. More information is available at knowyouroptions.com. When ready to request mortgage assistance, reach out to your mortgage company. This is the company you send your payments to each month, and you'll find that phone number on your mortgage statement. Additional relief assistance is available through our Disaster Response Network. Here, impacted homeowners can work with HUD-approved housing counselors to get help requesting financial relief through FEMA, insurance claims, and more. Homeowners can visit knowyouroptions.com/relief for more information or call 877-833-1746. Once again, 877-833-1746 or knowyouroptions.com.
Thank you for joining us on How to Disaster, a playbook to recover, rebuild, and reimagine. I want to leave you with this one thought. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we want you to know that you can get through this. You can recover, rebuild, and reimagine. But there's only one way you're going to do it, and that's together.